back. I'm sure everybody over this break kind of all grouped up and discussed what we talked about. What we'd like for you to do is, as we're getting into, basically we're going to be covering page 5, breaking through the lack of communication, verbal and/or written procedure. You're going to see how this stuff ties in with what we've been talking about as far as these personal skills. And this is where we're saying in the ABS we have to grab these base skills both of people and process, because we can't improve the other one long term without the improvement. We can't improve it without the improvement of both. So this is kind of the focus of this ABS and of this breaking through communication. Think of all these things that we talked about as well as our personal characteristics. And now we're going to look at the product of lack of communication. Now remember what we're saying here, the lack of communication. We're talking about, we feel it's very important, even though, you know, we've had some folks say, well, all you're doing is talking about the negative stuff. Well, I think we, again, have gone through so much of this stuff where we're saying, don't say it's a problem, call it an opportunity. You know, and we've kind of soft-sold all this, and what I believe is important for us is to understand what these barriers look like internally within these organizations. By understanding and having that awareness, we're able to fix and improve them and not let them manipulate or move us around. So if you look at this, our first one is, we want to say, what does the product of lack of communication look like? Let's take number 1, fear shuts down employees. Now, we talked about fear in our first barrier. And what we're saying here is that, and we constantly referred back, it's going to be really tough to separate all 4 of these barriers. And when we're saying fear shuts down the employees, in the fact that fear not only will shut down, but almost will paralyze an organization, that and in turn, we will become very much of just moving through the organization without much interaction. And we're saying number 2, it looks at misunderstanding what is wanted. When there's lack of communication, verbal and or written, now remember everything we're talking about in this communication is verbal and or written and are interchangeable. When we're saying that the misunderstanding what is wanted is that when there's a particular thing going on internally within the organization and we have the fear, we have all the other stuff that we're talking about, is that there's usually misunderstanding what is wanted. All of a sudden, all of us come to the table with our part of the deal and we're not bringing the right things. How many of us have done something that we thought the company, the organization, our manager, our co-worker wanted, we turn it in, and then all of a sudden it's completely different and they're saying, this is not what I wanted. So if you look at the misunderstanding, especially when it's in a verbal form, even if you do have the communication and the communication is verbal, if it's not written, it's due to interpretation. So this is where a lot of the frustration comes in. And what I also hear is, I ain't got enough time to write it down. Well, but isn't it amazing we always have enough time to do it again? Think of all of these things that we're constantly redoing internally within the organization. Number 3, it looks at employees doing what they perceived as wanted. Now this is very interesting here, because remember we said that our employees are really trying to do a good job. Other than maybe the 1%, no one has this demon in them that gets them pumped up every morning that I'm going to go to work and make chaos for my coworkers and the organization. Is that really what happens? The employees are really doing what they perceive you wanted. What's interesting is that I hear that's a no-brainer, that's common sense. Well, it might be common sense or a no-brainer to you, but when you're communicating to somebody else, it's due to interpretation. So if you're looking at employees perceived, they're doing what they want. Employees, remember, are all trying to do the right thing. They're all trying to do a good job. It's the informal organization, it's the 4 barriers to quality that prevent that. So when you look at, when somebody comes back with something a little different than what you wanted, remember that 4 barrier to quality appraisal we talked about, run through that. First question on the communication, was that communication in written form? Chances are it wasn't. So now they're perceiving what you wanted. If you look at number 4, pin up frustration. Now I'm not sure if that's a correct word or not, but pin up is what we're talking about. As the organization starts shutting down, the communication stops throughout the organization. Remember, we said we get very reactive to the stuff that's happening. The pin-up frustration is that the communication, I no longer have anyone to talk with, so all this frustration internally, because there's no way to get rid of it, is that it starts building up internally. And what we're saying is that that's what that pin-up frustration is. So there's no avenue to release it because of the fear, because of lack of written procedure, because of lack of training, any of these things, and the communication starts shutting it down. So it starts boiling inside of us now. And boiling's a bad word I have problems with. So if you look at, that's what we're talking about, pin-up frustration. Next, let's look at doing things over. Now, this is another interesting thing. You know, I constantly have been told that, Bruce, we don't have time to write it down. We don't have time for meetings. We got to get the deal out. We got to do this. We do. And what we're saying here is that you don't have time to put it in writing, but every one of us have time again to do it again. Now, think about that. Look at how many things that we do internally within the organization that we are doing again, or that somebody else dropped the ball, we're having to pick the ball up, drop our stuff, and now we're having to do it again. If you look at it, who in the long term is losing? It's our customer. Because remember, we had mentioned earlier that 67% of our employees, 67% of our customers that we lose has nothing to do with our product or our price, or it has something to do internally what we did to them. So think about that. We spend so much time getting new customers and going out and doing all this. We're not even focusing on the ones that we have. But not only that, it's not necessarily our price, and that's all we're told. Got to get it cheaper, got to get it, do it. It's usually something that we've done internally within the organization. And a lot of it is your customer can deal with a commitment, but what they can't deal is that you give them a date and we don't meet that date. So that's what we're talking about, doing things over. And in the long run, our customer is the one that hurts. Next is number 6. Now this is really kind of a interesting one here. It says no one to talk to about their concerns at home or at work. Now, you've heard us say several times that when this stuff starts at work or it starts at home, we're told to leave your problems at home, leave your problems at work, and don't bring them. And well, I've never met anybody that can turn it off. I've met a lot of folks that, oh yeah, I don't let what happens here at work bother me, or the problems I got at home I don't let bother me. Every one of us. There was a fellow, Mr. Boswell, there out in LA that had a company. And Mr. Boswell, I've always seen with these entrepreneurs, they always have this thing that they cling to that really are their thing that they focus with their employees internally, or that thing that makes them special or unique. And Mr. Boswell said, he goes, Bruce, when we've got an employee that has a problem, he goes, I don't wait. He goes, we know who they are. We know they having a bad day. He goes, if you're going to wait for them to come through that door and talk to you about the problem, they're not. He goes, I go out in the shop floor, I get them, and I bring them back in, and we talk about it. Those old wise sayings that were out there, you know, just to get it off your chest, make you feel better, and that's a lot to that. So if you look at with the shutdown communication, we have no one to talk to, because as we start shutting down at work, believe it or not, we start going home and we start shutting down at home. And it's interesting, we're going, oh, this stuff don't bother me. Interesting story, I was coming back from a plant a few years ago, well actually about 10 years ago, and I walked in the door, my daughter ran up and she goes, you know, Daddy, how's everything going, and this and that. My wife was back at the house there, and my wife hollered across and said, well, how'd your day go? Oh, I go, if it was any better, couldn't stand it, and you know, and that. And I walked through, and my daughter, which is 2 years old, says, Daddy, what's the matter? Here it was, I thought that I was keeping it under control, and I wasn't going to let all that hostile board stuff that I had been going through bother me. And I was saying, okay, I'm going to shut it down. I'm not going to talk about it, and I'm not going to bother. But here is my daughter that's under 5 years old can sense that there's a problem. So this is what we're talking about. When we shut down the communication, man, it really gets bad. We shut it down at home, shut it down at work. We're having problems at home. And we talked about this the other day. Other than a few of us, most of us don't go to a country club after work. Most of us are working and are at home. So if you look at it, if we're not going to be able to open up and communicate with our coworkers and our boss, then who in the heck and where are we going to get this avenue if it's shut down at home? And if it's shut down at work, we've got to have that communication up at home to run it across our spouse to kind of talk about it. So that's the bad thing about that communication when it starts shutting down, and we're saying it starts building up, and then all of a sudden all you're doing is dealing with a bunch of negative stuff. If you look at now, we're talking about feeling alone. I'm the only one that cares. Now this is an interesting thing here. We're looking at how many of us have gone to work at the beginning of the day, say, this is what I'm going to do. At the end of the day, we haven't accomplished anything that we had set out to do. And when there's the communication shut down, the pressure of the 4 barriers, and we're sitting there, and how many of us have like turned the light off and we're just like going, like we've been hit all day long, and go, am I the only one that cares in this organization? How many of y'all have felt like that? And what's interesting, what I have discovered is that almost everybody in that organization that's turning out the light feels like they're the only one that cares. Because of the communication and because of these lack of skills, base skills that we have, we're either communicating negatively or we're not communicating or we're afraid to talk about it, or there's a gazillion things. So if you look at everything that we're talking about, there's so much really kind of stacked against us. And if we're not aware of it and conscious of all these barriers and the things that are happening, you wonder why some of us have problems sleeping at night. If you look at verbal and or verbal order request, this is where we really get into problems. We call it, and somebody in one of the things named it, they called it pardon the accent, a hallway pass. And that was, I'm walking down the hallway and somebody goes, hey, I need you to do this, 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 and this. You're going about your day. How many of you have got one of those hallway passes? 2 days later, somebody comes up and they goes, okay, where is it? You're going, where's what? They said, well, I told you the other day. And you're going, oh, man, I forgot about that. Or I thought you were going to give me a call back. This is what we're saying about the lack of communication, verbal and written. How well was it explained what I wanted, and was it in written form? Remember, when it's not in written form, it's due to interpretation. The other thing is, remember when they come up and tell you that, hey, I don't have time to write it down, but we have time to do it again. And another interesting thing that we don't have this time thing is that we get into it and we're saying, to sit down, then you get the extreme of what we talked about earlier. The extreme, well, what do you want me to do? Write down everything? If I need to go to the bathroom, do I have to write down? Well, that's that extreme attitude, and that's that frustration that's built up. And really, as we're talked about all throughout this thing, is that a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, that the deal, what we call sitting on the table, has nothing to do with what's on the table. It's all these other things internally within us, internally within the organization, under the table, whether it's people, process, or procedure that we're dealing with. Trying to get to the deal is the tough thing. Because remember, we're saying if you got 15 people in the room, you probably had 25 different personalities. And those, depending on their situation at home or work, is depending on what personality that you're dealing with. And when we're not aware of this, that's why we're talking about the reinforcement. If we're not aware of it, it's so easy all of a sudden over years. And see, most companies don't, there's no company that starts out and says, hey, I'm going to do 120 million in sales and I'm going to be just as disorganized and dysfunctional that we have nothing written down, we're doing no training, we have plenty of fear. There's none of them that start out. They evolve to that, and it's so gradual we don't know that it's happening. And it's interesting, they're talking about I think my wife was actually telling me about this, that you could put like a frog in a water on a pot on the stove and turn it up, and it'll gradually just keep heating up until where the frog dies. He won't hop out of it. It's so gradual that it just becomes a part. And that is what has happened, not only in our organizations, but in our personal life and in this country in general. So if you're looking at the verbal order request, is that I need you to do something, or I'm phoning in a request out in the field that I ain't got time to write out an order, but again, we got time to do it again. Let's look at number 9, which is the negative rap. Now this is really kind of interesting here. We started all this stuff with this negative rap stuff before they had rap music, believe it or not. That's how long back we go. If you're looking at, because when we were kids in our neighborhood, we just called it, you kind of get the rap down. Here is that the negative rap is that what I've discovered is that most of us, whether we're at work or at home, have a tendency to interact in negative rap. And that is, we really have nothing positive to say, but we're always picking out the bad things about somebody and joking about them. And when we go into an organization, we're talking about the negative rap. The interesting thing, our subconscious can't sort through and say, well, they're talking that negative rap, and what they're really saying is that, oh, that's the way we play with each other, and we've been kidding each other for 5 years, and that's how we interact. The mind can't sort what's play and what's real. It's registered as a negative. So what we don't realize is that that stuff is building up. Not only is it building up internally, but then that's all of a sudden how we start communicating in a negative manner. Then we are doing it at work to talk, and I don't know what it is. It just seems we get into that as habit. We go to work, and the only way we can do is talk something negative or to get somebody to interact. Guess what? We start taking it home. And I want you to really look at going home, and when you're at in the living room with your spouse or family or something, think of the things that you either pointed out, talked about in a negative rap. That either you said, well, you know, that was, I really appreciate that present you got me, but, you know, maybe it could have been a size larger, or maybe it could have been a cherry pie instead of an apple pie. And if you look at it, what we're doing is that subconsciously we're not only projecting a negative attitude, subconsciously it's building up internally within us, and then all of a sudden that starts affecting us in a negative manner. So what you see is that the whole organization gets this negative rap, and it spreads again like this cancer in the organization to where nothing's positive. The other interesting thing, if you think you can shut it off when you answer the phone with your customer, you can't do it. Whether you realize it or not, it starts taking a hold, and you can't shut it on or off because it becomes a part of you, just similar to what we were talking about, that habit and those bad habits and that affirmation. If you look at number 10, it says no communication between jobs, departments, divisions, or between management, employees, and unions. Now, I've been in every one of those environments before, and what's interesting, when there's a lack of communication, verbal and or written, it's total shutdown. And remember, we're talking about also involved in this is the fear, the trust, the consistency that promotes the truth, all these other things, and the lack of communication starts shutting down. So where I usually see it is that if I'm in sales and we're out there selling our product or widget, whatever you want to call it, and we're out there selling, we're not communicating with our home office or our production, and we're selling things that we can't provide. And we're saying that here, when it's shut down, is that I'm selling, I don't even know if really we can deliver it or not. So in a sense, we're making commitments out in the marketplace, we're selling a particular product or service, come back in, and we don't have the support or the understanding of the organization whether we can do it or not do it. Then all of a sudden we make a commitment on a date. That's what we're talking about, the managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring. A month later, all of a sudden now our customer has not got their product or service. Then what we do, we start that cycle, that fire, start putting out the fire, start rushing them out there, loading the stuff in our trucks or overnighting it. I'm real curious that y'all look at your overnight express bill and look at all the things that got out at the last minute that we knew were going to happen. anywhere from a week to 2 weeks to months ago. And again, that has to do with the communication and the lack of managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring. Number 11, one-way communication. When there's the fear and the 4 barriers, the communication really gets in a direction of one way. And that's literally me coming to you and telling you what I want, not getting any feedback, not wanting any feedback, or not really realizing I even need feedback. So the communication becomes very one way, meaning that I'm just sitting here receiving the stuff, I'm going to process it, I'm not even going to question on it, and then I'm going to move on and do the deal as I think you want it. That's the interpretation time. And this is what we're talking about here that's really kind of tough, is that especially if there's fear. If you've got your product manager up on the top telling you this is what we need to do, and if there's fear between you and him, you're not going to give them the input. Hey, how's that new product that we're selling? How's that thing working out? Oh, it's working out pretty good, even though we know that it already has some issues. So if you look at it, we need to work on all of these 4 barriers. Interesting thing number 12, memos not in writing or well thought out. How many of us not only have sent, but received memos that we didn't even know what in the world they were talking about? And when we first got started, we would go through and define some of this stuff, send it out, and all of a sudden people are coming back and going, well, I thought this is what you meant. So we learn this, all of these things really by experience, and that is that what we're doing is that we're not thinking through the process, we're probably not getting the people involved, and all of a sudden we're putting it out like we interpret it, and this is where we're talking about the 4 barriers. If you have fear, you're not going to get the communication, and you're not going to get the written procedure, and you're not going to get the training. Here's another interesting one here, 13, hearsay. Years ago, we used to call hearsay something else, but we changed it hearsay the rumor mill because we've matured over the years here. And if you look at the hearsay, look at all of the things that get started around the water cooler, start talking about somebody or start talking about what the company's doing, that we have no fact, no data, and no information on. Then all of a sudden, as far as that we're concerned, is that it's the truth. And if you look at it with this rumor mill, this hearsay that's going through here, now think of, let's just say that we've got this hearsay, and especially, let's even take it and say we've got that 1% that's setting that rumor or that thing that just drops in your mind saying, well, yeah, I know the other day, but they really didn't do that. And you're going like, ooh, well, what they mean by that? And then they're gone. Then that starts you thinking. Now, compound the hearsay that we get something that we hear, we have no data to support it, and think about if it's fear. Now, think if there's fear involved. Not only is it compounded by hearsay, but the fact that there's fear, just think of how we're going to react. Now, if there's trust internally within that organization, and we have that open and honest communication, we can go probably address that issue with that person or bring it up and get it solved. But if you've got that, there ain't no way in the world that we're going to do it. And the more fear, the less communication. So number 14 is not written, not accountable. This is what we're saying here, is that if you look at this, if your order request or whatever that you're particularly wanting to do is not in written form, it's due to interpretation. So if you look at this, the not written, how in the world can you hold it accountable? I've been in so many things where we're sitting across at a table, one person is saying this, another person is saying that. There's no data there to support nothing. We have no idea even why it went wrong. And all we're doing is defending and justifying and digging in and trying to pass blame. We're doing absolutely nothing to solve the problem. And when it's not in a written form, there's no data there to go back and look at where it went sideways. So with the lack of communication, verbal or written, if you really want some accountability, no matter what it is, you had better look at putting that thing in writing. Oh, but remember, I don't have time to put it in writing. But you do have time to do it again. if you look at this, it says informal managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring. The MPSM. If you look at this, this is what we're talking about, is that if it's not in written form and if we're not communicating it, how in the world are you going to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor internally within the organization of what's happening? When there's a lack of communication, and this is what we're saying with the order request, especially even internally within an office environment, we're processing, let's say we're selling computer software or computer service, is that I'm in an office environment supporting the sale of that product and the service of that product. So if we're looking at it and I'm getting stuff coming across the desk all day and all I'm doing is getting people telling me what to do, and then all of a sudden I come to you and want something done and you're going, hey, I'm so busy I can't do it. Well, what are you doing? They can't tell you what they're doing. So we're saying if you're looking at doing things, get that thing in writing, and it's even as important as, let's say, a support person that's processing paperwork, is that every time we go there, they're working day and night. We have nothing that we can manage, plan, schedule, and monitor, even if it's an internal request. They don't have time to do nothing. They're frustrated. Then what we also find is that the 1% is learn how to deal off their issues to this person. So if you look at this, in an informal organization, lack of communication, verbal and written, how in the world are you going to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor? Okay, let's look at number 16, the last communication a problem. Now this is really interesting here. We're talking about the I don't know how many times we have said, but every time it seems like we get together as a department or as a manager or with my co-workers, it's with a problem. I'd like for y'all to really step back and think about that one. When is the last time that we all got together? It usually has to do with a problem. It has nothing to do with sit down and let's plan, let's schedule, let's manage, let's monitor. What it has to do with, it's a problem because we didn't do that before. So now what happens, we're going through the office or we're going through the plant, and then all of a sudden somebody's coming into my department, whether it's another department, a boss or whatever, or a co-worker. We're going, oh, okay, what's happened now? What have I done? I got to think through. It's almost like catching your kids doing something wrong. We're starting, okay, now what did I do? I know I've done something wrong. What have I got to? So if you look at that, the last time we have communicated with the majority of our employees of when it's been a problem, we need to change that. We need to flip it around. We need to see our employees when the heck we're just going to go by and say hello, if nothing else. And that's another interesting thing. They talk about all this time management. Man, I don't know about y'all, but all these gadgets they got now, my time hadn't gotten any better. My time hadn't gotten any less complicated. But what they're telling us is that we sit down and have a conversation with a coworker or at home, it's wasted time. It needs to be productive. It needs to be managed. You know, we need to really step back and look at all of this stuff internally and what we've been hearing for all these last 30 or 40 years of how we need to do business and get back to those base skills, those base interactions. Okay, so we've talked about the product of lack of communication. We talked about what it looks like and all of that. I'm sure there's some of y'all that can identify with some of these issues. Now, if you can't, kind of stretch and think you probably got a friend that might have some of these problems or something. So maybe they could help you identify with what we're talking about here. But if you would, we'd really like for you to step back and look. Now, this workshop is also a good one to sit down and have discussions with your coworkers, to sit down and talk about these issues and look at them and start getting some of this stuff out. How do we, well, I'm going to say that. But if you look at it, how many times do we get into meetings and say, okay, what problems do we have? And they turn into a gripe session. Then all of a sudden an hour goes to 2 hours, goes to 3 hours. We talk about it, we beat it to death. We end up talking about everything in the world and everything known to civilized man, but we never put anything in place to fix it. Think about that. And the reason is, number one, we don't have the skills throughout the organization. We got the 4 barriers to quality. How do you fix something that is not defined? If you look at it, the loop starts again. this is what we're saying with the 4 barriers. Think of everything that we're talking about. So how do we address the lack of communication? Number 1 is, we look at this, we remove the fear of expression and our action. Shut down employees, start to open up. Again, we're saying we can't just focus on trying to open up communication, not working on removing the fear, not doing the consistency. See, there's a lot of things that we have to do internally within the organization, and it's all across the board on what we have to do. So if you look at this, when we start removing the fear of expression or action, the shutdown employees start to get involved again. 24-month requirements. If we're looking at over the first 24 months in this transition, how in the world do we move from an informal to a formal organization? And we're saying 24 months. And man, I've heard it so much till I'm sick of hearing it, and that is, I ain't got 24 months. Son, what I'll tell you is that you do whatever you're going to do, and it's going to be a quarter in a month, and I'm going to see you 2 years down the road, you're still going to be going through the same thing, but you have not made one step forward in resolving any issue internally within the organization. The reason you don't have time, you don't make time, and then if you do have time, what are you going to do? This is where we have to have a system that we can manage, plan, schedule, and monitor and move through this. And with this awareness and these base skills, if you look at everything we're talking about, good night, look at what all we have to do. That's why these base skills have to be throughout the organization. We cannot dump it on management and let them do it or ask them to do it because they're not going to be able to do it. We have to have everybody in the organization involved. So the 24 months here are, we got to look at developing the team, what we talked about, the base work centers, our meetings, our minutes, our agendas, the leadership, what we call training leadership. And the only way that we learn all this is through doing. We call it we learn through doing. So a 24-month minimum commitment to get this deal started. Anything that you're going to do within the organization long term. Number 3 is interpersonal skill training, and that's what we're talking about, learn through doing. We can read all this mess all day long, and we can do all this, and it's so much like in the companies that we get started in, is that they can read the book, they can understand it, it sounds good, and we can take the stuff and read it in training, and it looks good, sounds good, it seems logical. Then we get out and trying to do it, and man, it's tough. Then that's how we learn it. It's just like how many of us have got a bike for Christmas. We're having to put that thing together. What is the first thing we do? We open the box, get the instructions, and throw them out and start putting it. I can go to any CNC operator known to civilized man in any organization. I don't care what they're milling, anything, is that the first thing they do, they drop the machine at the floor. That person will start tinkering around until they figure it out, and they learn through doing. That's how most of us learn. We learn through doing. But what we're trying to say is let's have some parameters. Let's keep it in here, not wide open, but let's give some direction to that. And so the personal skill, how we learn, is literally by being in a team meeting, interacting about our jobs with our base work centers, constantly reinforcing those positive attitudes, is that we learn through doing that. We don't learn through it reading a book. That's why everybody in the organization has to do it. That's why it has to constantly be reinforced. Positive attitude. Negative attitude is unacceptable. This is really interesting. Somebody told me after one meeting, they go, Bruce, I'm not like you. I can't be positive. I can't be up. I deserve to be the unhappiest guy known to man, and I don't like being happy. And I go, you know, that's kind of interesting. That's kind of really sad. I said, because really we have that power internally to either be positive or negative, happy or unhappy. What we're saying in our organization, I don't care if that person can read or write. If that person has a good attitude and if that person has a smile, I guarantee you can do more with that person than a person that has more education and more worldly whereabouts known to man, that person that has that good attitude and good heart and that smile. Because that smile is a window, and a smile is a universal. You can pull up anywhere in the world, whether you're in the Amazon jungle or anything, you flash a smile to somebody that can't even speak language, they will smile back, and the whole body changes. Smile is a universal language. Open and honest communication with oneself and one job. Leadership encouraged daily. This is so much of the stuff that we go to. How many of us have gone to seminars, get pumped up, do all the stuff, come back to work, and pretty soon the informal organization is beating the stuffing out of us. And all of a sudden, we stop doing it. What we're saying is the biggest part of the job for management is to lead, and the leadership has to constantly reinforce these positive attitudes and positive things that are happening and encouraging us daily. Because our employees were all in battle with a daily insecurity. Smile. This is one of the things we did. It says a smile in the morning improves life every day. Smile in the AM. And how we kind of started coming up with that. We were at this plant meeting one morning, and somebody came in and he goes, I said, guys, you know, we've got to learn to communicate with our employees, and we've got to go up to them and say, hey, in the morning. We got to be the ones. And this guy literally comes unglued and says, hey, it's just as much their responsibility to say hello to me in the morning as it is to them, for me. And he says, they owe it. I'm their boss. And I go, oh. I said, number one, Tom, I think you need to back off that coffee. Number two is that you're in leadership, your management, you have to set the tone for business. And the employees are powerless. That's why in leadership has to take the role of doing that. So we said, we called it Smile in the AM. And you wouldn't believe this, in this real big company we had. All these guys, and we happened to have like 5 or 6 unions, or actually 5 unions on site. And so I come in one morning, and it's like the parting of the Red Sea. Here comes this guy coming out, and he's going, I understand that you guys are having a meeting this morning. I go, yeah. And he goes, what's it about? I said, why don't you come to it? He goes, you mean I could come to the meeting? We have learned to defuse all these issues internally within the organization. And that was a particular one there that somebody in the back says, hey, well, smile in the AM. And these guys turned around and they were like ready to whip this guy that said that. And what was interesting, as I left, they all started saying this to one another, smile in the AM. And you know when they did that is when they had a fire, because most of us have been putting out a fire in the morning. So they come over and they go, hey, smile in the AM. And all of a sudden these guys are about ready to knock each other out. And what I realized is that by picking at one another, because that's how they had communicated in the negative rap, is that they started teasing each other with the smile in the morning. You wouldn't believe it. In 6 months, they were talking to one another. It had got them to at least to say something to the other person, whether it was good or bad, but when they'd say it, they all smiled because it was so stupid. They'd start laughing about it, start making fun about it, and then they'd start making fun about this big hick from Alabama that was in here talking about this smile in the morning. Pretty soon they were talking. So that's as simple as it is. Set these things into place and reinforce them and encourage them. Attack the issues, nothing else. Not our department, divisions, decisions, or people. What we're saying here, we don't need to blame, we don't need to attack. What we need to do here is attack the issues, not our people. And there's some blame things, and we'll go into some of these a little later. We're saying some of it in here, we feel we have to blame, and when there's fear, especially fear and lack of, we have to, what we call board the blame plane. And that is, I got to blame, I got to defend, I got to justify, I got to do all this other stuff because of the fear. And what we're saying here is let's attack the issues, not our people. If you really still have to blame somebody, and somebody we were at a place the other day, he's going, really, Bruce, that's nature. I go, it is. If you really want to blame or attack somebody, attack the program, attack me, attack whatever, but don't attack each other. But try to focus in on the issue. And then it says two-way communication, free flow of information. And that was interesting here. The free flow, on an organizational chart, we usually had those arrows going down and this and that. And it's interesting. I've seen some new organizational charts that kind of come from this way. So I don't know what seminar is going on out there, but there's one that their organization is supported this way and they're only one level. So if you look at, we're saying an organizational chart, instead of having arrows going down, it needs to be in a diamond with arrows going in each direction, meaning that it's free flow of information. Everyone in the organization ought to be able to walk up to anyone in that organization and ask an open and honest question and get an open and honest answer. And I know that they're going, and how many times have you heard got to use the chain of command? First question is, if they choose not to do it, the question is why? Number two is, why do you have a problem with them doing that? Usually has to do with fear. Usually has to do with all these other things that we're talking about. So if you look at the majority of the stuff, if we could just walk up to somebody and say, here's the deal, this is what we got to do and fix it, and we could move on. And we've heard use the chain of command out of respect. Well, I got a problem with that. There's somebody there that's got an ego out of gear. What we're saying here is that sounds good, it looks good, use the chain of command, but what if the next link in the chain is my boss and that's shutting me down? Now what do I do? That's another way that we address that stuff was with that quality issue. So we're saying anyone, we need to get to where you can walk to anybody. Remember, we got to observe the two rules. Our employees aren't going to abuse it, but I guarantee you who is going to abuse it, that 1% is going to abuse it. But we'll look at them, they'll be the same ones doing it anytime. But what it'll do, they'll start sticking out. And with this awareness, our employees will start identifying that 1%. Because if you look at that 1%, they've never contributed nothing to the organization, but they're the first ones there to tell us we're all screwing up or doing something wrong, or we could be doing it another way, and they're not even doing nothing. Twice as much, two-way communication, leading the change, management has to do it. Twice as much listening as talking, new ideas, people wanting to contribute. If we want accountability, it must be in written form. This verbal stuff, just don't get it. And if you look at open with, welcoming orange, quality issues, we had one company that set a record that did something like 50 quality issues. Remember, they can be people, personality, or procedure. What happened was, and that started within the first 3 or 4 months of that organization, it showed us that there wasn't the fear. And the first quality issue we had was on the owner of the company. They had 100 and something employees. Well, that showed there wasn't that fear, but that communication had broken down. See, that's what we're talking about, the fear. If there's no fear, that person felt free to come up and bring it. It happened to be against the owner of the organization. And those quality issues are tough, but if we take them within the right framework, we can process through them. So we ought to welcome employees coming up. Instead of, remember, we're saying we usually attack the messenger that's bringing that stuff. And then, remember, that's how we start shutting down. That's the communication. Then the whole deal starts again. Let's look at the results. After doing all this and working through this, number one, employees are happier. Why are they happy? I was actually at a company, they go, well, who cares if my employees are happy or not? How productive do you think that unhappy employee is? And that was almost, and it was kind of an emotional deal with me because I couldn't believe that. If your employees are happier and they're communicating, believe me, they're going to be much more productive and proactive. Doing things right when we have written communication, open communication, proactive attitude. Remember, we're coming out, getting out instead of when it gets a problem. We're dealing with data because if we can move it to written communication, we can problem solve, especially when we're communicating. Instead of letting that problem just keep getting pushed around the organization, and a positive attitude. Our attitude's going to change. Then let's look at learn to write procedures. As we're talking about all this stuff and we're looking at the procedures and writing, we're learning how to write procedure. If you're looking at the communication, remember, we can't have written procedure until we have open and honest communication. Can't get that and remove the fear. Do you see what we're talking about? These things are all dependent on one another. I belong. Another interesting thing, once the communication starts opening up, we feel as though we belong to the organization, that we're a part of that organization. That's what you want. So many companies I go into start out as a family or we're a group and we want to belong, and you hear that. As the organization grows and becomes more dysfunctional, We feel like we're everything but belonging to that company. Then it says here, faster response to problems. Remember, we become proactive instead of reactive. Reactive is, we know 6 months down the road there's a problem. Proactive and open, honest communication and written communication, we're faster response to problems. My input counts. Another interesting thing, that's what brings me in. I feel as though I belong. You start getting new thoughts and good ideas. Now, remember this, breaking through lack of communication, verbal and or written, is also chapter 2 in the book and stuff. So we've talked about breaking through the lack of communication. Now we're going to go through and look at some things. We've got some surveys that are coming up. The corporate citizenship survey. I'd like for everybody to kind of turn to that. That's page 6 in your book. And if you look at the principles of corporate citizenship, this was done by the Department of Labor. And I'm kind of curious, I wonder if they're following their own form here, and kind of think about what's happening in Washington and in government and see if they're following their stuff. It's interesting. It says family-friendly workplace, economic security, investment in employees, partnership with employees, safe and secure workplace. Now, what we'd like for you to do in this corporate citizenship is to take this survey, and it's kind of optional, but I think it'd be curious to see what your employees are feeling. And pass that thing around and turn it back in, and you guys take a look at it. And this will be some interesting things for you to look at. And let's look at page number 7, which is the 4 barriers to quality survey. Now, what we're going to do is that we're going to ask you to take this 4 barriers to quality survey, and we're going to ask you to pass it out. And it's interesting here. What we're going to do is that we're going to ask you to go through and look at these and check off from 1 to 5 and look at, I want you to survey your department and our boss. Then I want you to basically survey the company or the organization. What's an interesting thing you're going to find is that I'll always rate myself higher than the other departments, and that is I'm doing, and it'll be a point to a point and a half. Management will rate themselves higher by almost a full point at the minimum to 2 points higher of their department or their organization. And then down at the bottom, it was interesting. We put on the thing because we started getting these things back. We literally had to put on there, are you management or do you think you're management? Because the surveys were coming back so skewed that we had to put either you're management or non-management. And the reason is that when there's a lot of fear, and it's like if we're coming up that we have issues internally within the organization, it's meaning my fault. And we're saying we can't blame, we don't want to go there, we don't even want to look at that stuff. So if you look at that, that's the 4 barriers to quality survey. We're asking you to pass it out in your organization, do it around, and pick it back up and post it and talk about it. That'd be some good discussion things at those strategic planning meetings that you're having. That would be some interesting feedback. All right, let's look at number 8, the open door policy. The open door policy is a pretty interesting story. And we're going to ask you to put all the stuff up on the screen. And it says, do you know what's really strange? What's really strange is that most of these CEOs believe that they have an open door policy. And I was telling you the one company the other day, and I come in, and the guy's up on the desk, and his veins are popping out of his neck. And he's just going, why didn't somebody tell me I had an open door policy? The open door policy is the perceived open door policy. The larger the organization you have, the less chances of that door being open. And it has nothing to do with the owner or the CEO or the boss. It has to do with the 4 barriers to quality. It has to do with my past employer. It has to do with my past experience. It has to do with my issues at home. But if you look at it, if you think that we can say we got an open door policy, I'm going to ask every one of y'all right now, how many of you do you have people lined up at the door waiting to go in and talk to you? You ain't got it. So if you look at it, so don't be disappointed. You ain't going to get it. You've got to go out and seek that. I've always said there's nothing more for an owner or a CEO of an organization to do than to spend time with their customers and to spend time with their employees. There's nothing more valuable than that. because everything else will work out. And you've got everybody else in the organization taking care of all that other stuff. So if you got to go out and create shareholder value or equity or look at raising more money, you got accountants and all that other stuff. Go do that. Focus in on your organization and your people, because that's your strength. And I'm tired of hearing that, oh, well, we got a great product, and if I'm a good salesman, then if I leave, the whole company will fall. If you take out any one of those processes in the system, the product or service is no good. Every job internally or base work center in that organization is just as important as the other one. Okay, and at the bottom, the life lesson, that thing down there, it goes, the open door policy in most organizations is shut. So I don't want you to be disappointed. Let's look at number 9, and it says, what ifing the deal to death? Let's go ahead and flash those things up there. And what we're talking about here, especially the 1%, and they call it this devil advocate thing. Well, it's my job to beat that deal to death. What you're going to see is that the whole organization starts taking on that same attitude. And before you know it, frontline folks are out there shutting down their communication with everybody else and with that customer. We'll take that same attitude to our customer. See, all these things that we're doing internally, believe it or not, get back to our customer. And if you look at this as what ifing the deal to death, we're sitting here and we're talking about every reason in the world why it ain't going to make. And pretty soon I'm going, you know, I don't even have any idea. I must have had way too many beers to even think that I could get this thing passed. Throw it off the table. I'll never bring this thing up again. So what's going to happen? This guy is going to start shutting down. The organization's going to start shutting down, and especially the 1%. The 1% is going to manipulate you and the organization with this what-ifing to manipulate you to get what's best for them, not what's best for their co-workers and not what's best for the organization. And it says, what-ifing the deal to death is a dangerous and perilous disease for an organization. Yes, it is, because you got it shut down and now you're becoming very reactive. Let's look at the shutdown employee. Speaking of those, it says, story number 78. A shutdown employee, and that's on page 11. If you look at a shutdown employee, a profile of a shutdown employee is one who comes into the program and sits at the back of the class in the corner with his arms crossed and slouched in a chair looking like he wants to whip the world. Because that person is usually so frustrated, they've tried to get out, they've tried to get involved, and all of a sudden we're saying it takes like 8 to 14 months, I'm not sure, well, I missed it, 9 to 18 months it takes for an employee to shut down. Because the informal organization will start beating them into submission. So the employee will become shut down and very reactive into the organization. So it usually, again, takes 9 to 18 months. Remember, when you first started your job, how enthusiastic you were? Pretty soon you get in, and it just starts sucking the life, the energy, the enthusiasm out of you. And before you know it, you're sitting there just wondering how in the world you're going to get up in the morning. Okay, so that's that shutdown employee. And the shutdown employee with potential is the biggest waste within the organization. And we're saying usually the star you're trying to seek or employ is already in your employment. The shutdown employee is a lot of talent that's usually a very good employee that has a lot of skills. They've become very reactive, and they just don't trust the organization, especially when we get in there. They're waiting to see, is this going to be another thing that we're say we're going to do, but we don't. Now, we're getting a little close on time, and what I want us to do is to kind of go to page number 12, and that's called the 5 phases of consensus agreement for team members. Because what we're talking about is the communication. There's a lot of things that have to happen in here, and we're looking at the teams. We're looking at the team phases. There's 5 phases what the teams are going to go through to an agreement. There's also team members' personal goals. What are these things that we need to remember as we're in these meetings and on these teams? Then there's the team barriers to a quality agreement. And these are things to be aware of. So if you look at here, we're talking about number 1, discussion, things to remember, things to be aware of. As we're getting into these phases of these team meetings, we're starting to discuss whatever that particular issue is. These are the things that we are going through. Number 2 is analyze. And it's saying that here we're now going into the second phase. We're looking at this deal. We're discussing it. We're explaining it. We're trying to get some reason and fact to it. Then remember the things to be aware of. 3, then we go through the decision. Number 4, then we go to an agreement. And usually the agreement is having to do with a written procedure. Then we're going through the implementation. And if you look at this, what we're talking about here, the summary, remember consistency remember consistent reinforcement promotes a change of habit. This is what we're talking about with the affirmation. So remember, we have to be consistent. It has to be a conscious. We have to gain an awareness of how all these things are interacting with us daily. So that's the 5 phases of consensus agreement. All right, next is that what we'd like for you to do is to look on and turn to page 13, frequently asked questions. Why do you say, these are the questions that usually after we get through one of these things, that people go, why do you say a profile of change or leadership? And that's really a good question, because what I realized as we wrote that, and that's I think chapter 5 in the book, is that in order to change we have to have leadership. And if you don't have leadership, you're not going to have change. And the same characteristics and the same skills are needed to change and to be a leader. So that's interesting. So if you look at all these leadership things you're going to, look at them. All they do is point out characteristics, but they never tell you in the world how in the world to lead an organization. This is what we're talking about here. The profile of change is also the profile of leadership, because it takes leadership to change, and we have to give the leadership the support, the process to change that organization and to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. And we're not talking a bunch of change about we're going to go into new markets. We're talking about changing to open up and to take care of these 4 barriers to quality. Just by defining our jobs, that's change, and that's fearful. Okay, let's look at number 2. Number 2 here is, I believe communication is problem number 1. This is what we're talking about, is that you're not going to have communication if you've got fear of expression or action. That's clear cut. So communication is not one. If you have no fear, you've got plenty of communication. Believe me on that one. Then it says, can you explain pent-up frustration shuts down ourselves and co-workers? Well, we're talking about there, the pent-up frustration is we start shutting down because we're frustrated. All of a sudden, we're not interacting anymore, and it becomes very frustrating for ourselves and our co-workers, because whether we like it or not or realize it or not, we're affecting ourselves and our co-workers. So the pent-up frustration is devastating to our employees. When we have no avenue to release it, either at home or work, it gets pent up. Let's look at number 4. What do you mean by written communication? Written communication is a work order, a request order, a memo, other than how we usually dictate procedure, and we'll get into our next class, but is by memo. And then it's not put anywhere. Then all of a sudden we're doing it for a week, and then all of a sudden we're not doing it anymore. So written communication is mainly looking at an order request, because that's going to do and tell us everything internally within the organization of what we've got to do. My department is doing the job, others aren't. I understand where you're coming from, but what we're saying there is that all the departments, there's not one department off by themselves saying, you know, I'm going to throw a wrench in everything that they're trying to do or the organization. All organizations and all departments feel just like you. So everybody's trying just as hard, but with the dysfunction of the 4 barriers and not having those base skills, that's why we're continually struggling with it. And then it says, what is a preconceived open door policy? We just talked about that preconceived open door policy. Whether you want it in your heart or not, it's not there. So it is preconceived. You've got to go out and seek that and get those employees and communicate, because that open, and especially the larger the organization is that the less communication, less chances of that door being opening. Now, we kind of covered a lot of things today. I'd like for you folks to go back and look at the materials, think about, and even get in some groups outside of these classes and talk about all these things that we've discussed here. And we look forward to seeing you here over the next few days, next few months with our training stuff. And thanks a lot, and have a good day.